In this video, we're going to build a router sled milling jig. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, maybe we don't have a planer at all to use. Or two, maybe we have a planer, but the planer isn't large enough to mill larger pieces of wood. And what I mean by mill wood is to take a piece of wood that is not level and even and actually mill it or plane it down. That way it actually becomes a nice, flat, usable piece of lumber. To build this jig, I'm using 3/4 inch melamine. The reason I chose this is the router will slide on it very easily because of a non-stick, slick surface that it has. Additionally, this is a very straight surface and it doesn't tend to warp very easily as long as it's taken care of. The first thing I'm doing is cutting my base and my top rails for the jig. The length of this jig is going to be 30 inches. This will allow me to mill lumber as wide as about 24 inches. And the length of the lumber that you mill will be determined by the length of the runners that you utilize with the jig. To cut and size the pieces appropriately, I'm using the router's base. Now everybody might have a different router, so therefore there's no one size, one dimension fits all setup. Instead, what you can do is take your router's base, set it in, and measure off of it to allow it to slide. Ideally, you want to leave about 1/16 to 1/8 inch space between the rails. This way, during use, it doesn't bind or drag against them. I will be assembling this jig using pocket hole screws. I chose pocket hole screws instead of glue because if one part gets damaged with pocket hole screws, you can simply remove it and replace it. There could be concern that the pocket hole screws themselves, when attaching them, would deform or adjust the true flatness of the melamine. But my experience is utilizing the outside edges and taking my time in doing this right, it had no effect on the usability and the straight lines on the interior where the router runs. Using your pocket hole jig, drill out the exterior sides of where your attach points will be. Next, I took my time and clamped down where I'm going to drill in my pocket hole screws to make sure that the boards do not shift and give me a true straight and flat attachment. When driving in your screws, be sure that your drill's torque adjustment is set low enough that you don't blow through, crack, or damage the melamine wood. I would recommend testing on a sample piece or setting it low and doing the final tighten by hand. I cut and attach the two end rails first. That way I can do a precise cut and perfectly fit in the side rails. The easiest way to do this is to take your time and sneak up on the cut, taking off a little at a time until it fits in just perfectly. Next, we attach the side rails the same way that we attach the end rails using pocket hole screws. Before attaching the second side, I like to make sure that the fitment is right by putting the router base back in and making sure that it slides freely. Now we can go ahead and finish attaching the second side rail, and a final test, your router should slide like this. Next, we'll attach a bottom rail at each end to prevent the jig from sliding off the runners. 5-second cash break. Here's a look at where we're at so far. So the jig is assembled. You can see the router slides very easily in here, and that's been assembled. Next, we need to cut out the slot where the router bit will go through the jig and actually be used to contact and mill the wood. So I'm starting by marking the path as you can see here, of where this will go. Once I have this marked, then I need to cut out the space. I chose to use my table saw to make the 2 long cuts for the slots. To do so, you need to remove the riving knife, and I would only do this if you feel comfortable and safe. If not, or if you don't have a table saw, then you can just use a jigsaw to get it done. The way I'll do this to use this table saw, I'll hold down with firm pressure my workpiece so it won't move as I slowly raise the blade. When I first set this up, I will raise the blade into the middle of the cut area to give me a visual that I can utilize to be sure that the blade lines up right where I want it to be on each line for each side. Once I find the right spot and I have the blade lined up with the line appropriately, I will then use the table saw fence to set it up as a guide so I can go all the way down the line. Now I continue this process for both sides, for both directions. Now I just need to cut out the 2 ends, and I'll use my jigsaw for that, but before doing that, I'm going to do a quick visual check and make sure that my router bit is going to fit through the slot. To cut the ends with the jigsaw, the first thing I do is mark my line of where I want my cut to be. Using a punch, I'll mark where the center point of my drill bit needs to be. I'll line this up so the outside edge of the drill bit stays within inside the line. Another reason to punch a small hole to start the drill bit with is it helps prevent the drill bit from wandering. Using the hole for a starting point for the jigsaw, I'll cut a line to each side at the end. Then I'll come back through and clean it up. And lastly, trim the sides at the ends to make the final cut clean and separate the slot. So here's a look at the router sled. You could clean this up a little bit more if you want, but to me it's good to go. Now it's time to move on to making the runners, which is the second part of this jig to allow you to work on your workpiece. Now this next part, I'm going to show you how I use my own lumber to mill and plane different sizes of runners for different height adjustments for this jig. If you don't have the tools needed to do this, or if you have something else you can use as far as 2 runners that are the same size, straightness, and height, then you can skip this step and go on to the last part where I have this all hooked up and show you how I'm using it. So to begin joining this lumber, the first thing I'm doing is using the joiner on the wide side of the board to get it totally flat and straight. The side you want to join will be the side that when you lay this lumber down on a flat surface doesn't wobble, which should be the concave side. If you use the other side first, because it will have movement, it will take a lot longer and be more difficult to join it down and get it flat. Now that we have one true straight flat surface, we need to use the joiner to get one of the sides at a 90 to this, so we can begin squaring up this lumber. So to do so, the flat side that we recently jointed will go up against the fence, and we will begin joining the 90-degree side to it. After a few passes, we can look and see everything looks good and do a final check with our square. Next, we need to mill the wider side that's opposite of the jointed side we've already done. I'm using my planer to do this. With each pass, you can see more and more of the surface will have the clean finish. Continue repeating this until the entire surface is done, adjusting the height down a little bit each pass. Now you can see we have 3 square flat sides. Using my table saw, I will cut and square the final side. I will also cut these down to their final dimensions for use with the router sled. sled jig. The runners will attach to a flat surface, allowing you to slide the jig back and forth on top of your workpiece. Next, I'll shim my workpiece as needed to get it as level as possible and prevent any movement or rocking while working on it. To prevent your workpiece from moving while milling it, you'll want to use something to hold it in place. I chose to use tape. You could also use hot glue or anything else that would work for you. Now that everything's set up and we're ready, I'm just checking my height and adjusting as needed. If I needed my sled to be higher or lower depending on the thickness of my workpiece, then I would just use different runners. So these particular runners will get to this height. If I turn them on their side, that will be a new height. I'll get myself a few sets of runners so it's adjustable in that fashion. This is more true and accurate in my experience than actually making adjustments on the jig itself, which over time can become unreliable. For big adjustments, I'll use different size runners, but for little adjustments, I'll make little incremental changes with my plunge router settings. So here's a look at the progress so far. It's looking really good. I'll dust this off so you can take a look at it. Now, there is a little bit left on these upper edges and corners that needs to be milled, but because I'll be adding epoxy and then milling one more pass afterwards for the final finish, I don't want to lose any more thickness than I have to, so this is going to be my stopping point. If this was the final finish, then what would be left is to sand, getting rid of the tool marks and the lines, and then you could apply your desired finish. These pieces are for some nightstands that I'm building, and if you want to see how those turn out, how the tops look, and how the overall project comes out, then make sure you like and subscribe to see these future videos. And here's a final look using this straight edge. You can see how this came out. It is looking good, it's true and accurate, and everything looks really nice and flush. That's it for today's video. As always, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.